Good evening, everyone. I wanted to welcome you to the webinar for this evening, where we're going to explore a recent article by Jim McLean on triple X factor. Before we get started on the webinar portion and the fun stuff, I just wanted to do a couple simple housekeeping things. The first is a number of the people, obviously, that are tuning in tonight are aware of Welch Technologies in our company and are familiar with myself, Chris Welch. But many of you aren't. You really have no idea what we do or anything about myself. I'm not going to waste a lot of time with a full bio or introduction. I have put a bio on our website, welche.com. That's welch-e.com. Under the seminar schedule section, there's a bio, so if you want to take a look and get more detail about my background, that's there. But just briefly, Welch Technologies has basically been providing clinical application motion analysis services to high-end sports performance facilities and physical therapy, and as well as teams, professional teams, coaches, since the early to mid-90s. And we've been privileged enough to provide those services to some really interesting, cool people in the golf world. Ledbetter Golf Academies, Greg Rose, who's now the driving force behind TPI, and the Titleist Performance Institute, was a client of ours for several years in the 90s, and other assorted industry people who we have great respect for, Gray Cook, Mark Verstegen, Pete Dravich, guys like that. Even Mike Bentley of it used to be Bentley Kinetics. So we've been doing this for quite some time now. However, the industry, and not just golf, but just generally in sports performance, physical therapy, and all aspects of the therapeutics and the training, has changed a lot in the last 10 years. And now some of what used to be resigned to just research, some of the technologies that have helped researchers for years are starting to actually play an active role in clinical application stuff, not just in golf swing, but looking at functional movement patterns, 3D motion analysis, force plate analysis, balance analysis, all kinds of really great stuff. And with that, with all these new concepts and new things coming into play, there's bound to be confusion. And so our goal at these webinars is to try to provide a source of information that stems from a research background and a kind of a more technical background, but hopefully without watering down concepts, brings it into a more clinical perspective for people. So we had great success with this last year on a smaller scale with kind of invite-only list, and this year we're opening it up to the general public, not only industry people, but players and athletes themselves. And we'll be doing these seminars and webinars not only in golf, but on just about every sport and training concept or training modality that you can imagine. So we're very excited about it. One last little housekeeping thing. As far as questions go, you'll see that there's a place where you can ask questions on your control panel there. I would highly recommend that as we're going along, anything that comes up, just jot down a question, submit it. There's way too many people involved in tonight's webinar, and I probably won't have enough time, so I probably won't get into answering the questions tonight. However, all those questions are stored, and I have access to those later, and what I'll probably do is go through and kind of group them into categories, and then create a kind of a multimedia format Q&A that we'll post sometime in the next, say, week. That'll answer a lot of those questions. We'll let people know when it posts. The other thing is, at the end of today's webinar, there'll be a survey window will pop up. There's two very simple questions. It'd be great if you could take 2 seconds to fill them out. The one was just general comments about tonight, and the other one, maybe the more important one in a way, is ideas and thoughts you have about topics for future discussion. So that being said, we'll get into the while we're all showed up today, the triple X factor article by Jim McLean. first thing I want to do is I want to start out by saying I do know Jim, not very well, but I've had several discussions with him on golf in the past, probably like the mid to late 90s. I have a lot of respect for Jim, and I have a lot of respect for what he's done as far as teaching. He works with a biomechanist by the name of Rob Neal. I don't know Rob personally, but I have the utmost respect for Rob and what he's done in his research. So I just want to, at the outset, let everyone know that I have the utmost respect for both of these individuals. So really what we wanted to do in this article was to go through and take the time in a more relaxed multimedia type format to explore some of these concepts. And hopefully, and again, the format for these webinars is a little bit looser, a little bit more conversational. We try not to get too stuffy and do slide presentations and things like that. So it's a little bit more conversational. So hopefully you get a little bit more out of that kind of approach. First thing I'm going to say before we actually get into the article itself is and in Jim's defense, or anyone who's writing any kind of article, I've done it myself, not for say Golf Digest, but for other publications. You have limited space. You're trying to keep everyone happy, and in these golf cases, like in tonight's case, you're talking about 3 or 4 major concepts, very complex concepts that are usually clumped into one very short article. Without the opportunity to get into any one of these areas in depth, and as a result, this stuff can be kind of misleading on its surface, on its face value. So, that's kind of what we're hopefully trying to do. And we will always critique, or not, critique's maybe not the best word, but we won't always explore magazine articles in these webinars. But from time to time, we'll definitely do that. I think there's a good opportunity in a more dynamic format to talk about these things. What I'm actually going to do is just kind of casually read through parts of this and make some commentary, and then at the end we're really going to kind of try to get into a little bit of technical stuff with respect to what's referred to here as the X factor. We'll describe probably a little bit more specifically as a stretch shorten cycle of the muscle groups. So I'm going to just kind of wind my way through the article a little bit. If we skip past the little intro, it says the original X factor measures the difference between shoulder turn and hip turn at the top of the backswing. I would think almost everybody involved in tonight's webinar is heard of or has some familiarity with the concept of the X factor. It was pretty much a static measurement looking at points in the backswing at peak turn between pelvic rotation and upper torso rotation. In fact, down here you can see kind of a little picture of what we're talking about. And then they go on to say, here we take a quantum leap forward with the triple X factor, a series of 3 downswing moves, the X factor, hip rise, and head swivel that today's top players use to maximize power. So again, just in this first paragraph, the one thing that jumps out at me that I really want to point out is this line right here. It says that today's top players use to maximize power. That leads one to believe that this is something new, that today's players are utilizing something called the X factor, triple X factor, and it's something new that the evolution of the sport has sort of evolved into. Now, we'll get into the 3 parts, but generally the X factor part of it, the stretch part of it, is not new. That's something that the body's been utilizing forever as a function of creating more effective work output by muscles, generally referred to as a stretch shorten cycle. And it's not something that's just now being utilized. It's something that's been utilized forever in the swing pattern, and quite frankly, probably forever in just about every dynamic distal end acceleration pattern you could think of back to the cavemen. So, again, it's just a little misleading. Today's top players using to maximize power. Everybody uses this concept, whether you do it well or not. Everybody's utilizing the stretch shorten cycle at some level, whether they're doing it well or not, and everyone has really since the dawn of man, but certainly in the golf game throughout the entire golf game. Here we have the next paragraph. Like the original X, the triple X focuses on 2 of the swing's 4 power sources. Okay, weight, shift, and rotation, the other 2 being arms and wrists. Again, not to be nitpicky about the article, but again, this is a somewhat misleading statement in that it says 2 of the swing's 4 power sources. And we're not going to get into this tonight really, because we're here to talk about muscular stretch shorten and the effect of power output on power output, but I think it's more probably easier to think about the fact that there's really one power source. There's one power process. There are a lot of components that are involved in the process, but there aren't multiple power sources, so to speak. You have one primary source of power generation, and then a process that allows speed to be summated from the bottom base up through the extremities out to the implement. So again, not to be overly critical, but that's something that, just so people aren't misled that there's these different power sources, there's a power process is probably the better way to think about it. So here we're going to get down into the 3 that they've described. This thing called X factor stretch, that'd be number 1. Number 2 being hip rise, and number 3 being head swivel. The way I'm going to attack this is I'm going to start with the stuff that I think don't really have any bearing on muscular stretch shorten, which is really what we're talking about when we talk about X factor stretch. And the first one is head swivel. Let's just briefly read through what Jim says about head swivel. I think he makes actually a lot of good points in head swivel, but I think it probably has nothing to do with, well, it has no real impact on stretch shorten and very little to do with the actual process of stretch shortening with respect to the golf swing. And we'll just read the first paragraph and some of the few things he says just to highlight. It says, most tour pros rotate their heads toward the target before impact, yet single swing thought for many amateurs is to keep the head down. Head swivel, or looking off to the ball, is, and he calls it the most controversial part of the triple X. Again, it doesn't really have any bearing on muscular stretch shorten. Golf swing mechanics, there are definitely a lot of things about it, even some biomechanically based kind of stuff, but as far as the ability to stretch shorten your musculature, create more work output by the muscles, and thereby increase power performance, it really doesn't have anything to do with that. If we read down to the last paragraph here, it says, turning your head through with the center of your body, not stuck looking down over the right shoulder, improves upper body rotation, weight transfer to the left leg, plus it helps prevent injury, decreasing stress in the neck and the back. I would agree 100%. I think that's a great statement, and it's a very important aspect of golf swing performance, certainly mechanics, but really as far as the stretch shorten part of what we're going to talk about, which is kind of that concept of the original X factor, really has little to no bearing on that at all. So we're going to kind of skip past that, although I think there's some good information in there. Now let's go to the hip rise. The hip rise, again, is in and of itself a whole webinar or multiple webinars, because really what we're talking about here are lower body mechanics. And to get into lower body mechanics is with looking at the relationship of the center of mass, center of pressure, and your ability to create shear force and torque, and translate that torque into rotational speed, is a really complex thing. It's very important, maybe one of the most important things in golf from a biomechanics standpoint. But again, it has impact on the stretch shorten overall. But when we talk about hip rise, we're not talking about anything that's really significant with respect to the stretch shorten cycle. So let's just quickly take a look at this real quick. It says, most people think the only connection in golf is the hands to the club. Of equal importance, however, is the feet to the ground, a huge power source. I would say this is absolutely right on the money. And not only is it a huge power source, it is the power source. It is the motivator behind generating speed, and then the process of transferring or pushing that speed out segment to segment out to your most distal end, which is your golf club. So lower body mechanics are absolutely crucial. The connection to the ground, absolutely crucial to performance in the golf swing, certainly biomechanically as well as mechanically, and it is the power source, not just a huge power source. Now, just real quick, one of the things I want to say is many golfers think the hips should turn level. That's simply not true. The right hip moves higher on the backswing, the left hip even higher on the forward swing. It's the hip rise that creates power surge, the player springing up from the ground. Okay, again, this is a whole webinar, so I'm not going to get into all the details because I'll eat up all my time and I'll never get to stretch shorten. But one of the things I want to point out very quickly, and I'm hoping I can draw on these pictures. Yeah, I can. Okay. The hips don't swivel. The hips, the pelvic girdle, the pelvis, the hip joints, does not move up and down. It may look like it from a 2D perspective when you're looking at a flat image on a screen or at a picture. The better way to think of this is that the hips or the pelvis, including not only the pelvis but all these body segments, but certainly the pelvis, wants to move perpendicular to the spine. So here you can see the spine angles tips back a little bit. There's a little bit of extension, a little bit left bending, which is normal. The pelvis is going to want to work perpendicular to that orientation. It looks visually on a flat diagram that the hip is rising up. But really what it's doing is moving on a plane perpendicular to the spine. And again, this is subtle, maybe it's semantics, but in concept, if you understand this, you'll be a lot better off when you're talking about teaching or training or playing golf. It's even more severe on the follow-through, and Jim points this out in his article. There's even more of a lifting look on the lead side through downswing and follow-through, but that's because we maintain a fairly consistent spine angle orientation on the backswing and in transition, but during the downswing, in order to maintain pitch to the ball, we go through a fairly aggressive extension right bending, especially obviously for right-handed golfers. The spine tilts quite a bit, even though if you're looking down line it stays in its orientation to the ball. It's going through a dramatic extension right bending sequence. When it does that, the spine obviously gets tilted. The pelvis is moving perpendicular to the spine. So again, it's probably semantics, but it's important because I think what'll happen, what starts happening is, I know Jim knows what he's talking about, and obviously Rob Neal knows what he's talking about biomechanically. But when it's put into a format like this Golf Digest article, it becomes somewhat confusing, and now you'll have golfers and teachers and trainers wanting to teach this up and down movement, this like swivelly movement, and unfortunately the pelvis isn't moving that way. The pelvis is moving rotationally and perpendicular to the axis of the spine. So again, I didn't want to waste too much time on the whole lower body concept thing, but I thought it was important to make mention of this, because I think it's a little misleading when you try to jam complex concepts, and I know Rob and Jim know what they're talking about, but when you try to jam it into a short format article, it can become misleading. So again, I don't want to get into a whole discussion about this, but it is important to understand that lower body mechanics are absolutely crucial, and in some ways you could consider them the power source, since they're the primary, they're the external torque or external force applied to the system. That's where the body creates its ability to create rotational speed, and then the process of segmentally sequencing out to the most distal end and amping that speed up every segment. It all starts with the lower body. But the concept of the hips swiveling back and forth or up and down is misleading, because really the hips are working perpendicular to the axis of the spine. On a 2D picture, it's going to look like one's going up, one's going down, but really they're trying to move perpendicular to the spine. So again, I don't want to waste too much time with that. I want to get more into the X factor concept. Excuse me. But I just wanted to hit those two. So in my opinion, when we're talking about X factor, we're talking about the stretch shorten cycle, and head swivel really has nothing to do with that, and hip rise it's in terms of the sort of the up and down movement, has nothing to do with that. Lower body mechanics has something to do with that, but that's a whole other webinar in and of itself. So very quickly, what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up a quick slide. I'm going to quote from 2 books, and again, email me if you want references. I'll try to put this stuff up on our website just so you can have some reference. Okay, I took this paragraph from a book, Neuromechanical Basis of Kinesiology by Roger Noka. Fantastic textbook for anybody, layperson, player, coach, certainly physical therapist. Here's a really quick description of what they call what's called the stretch shorten cycle. And I'll just read it to you, and then I want to read you one other, and then I'll explain this a little bit, and then we'll get into Jim's article with respect to the X factor. It says, a common pattern of muscle activation, particularly during high performance tasks, is to use an eccentric concentric sequence in which the active muscle is first lengthened, then shortened. The advantage of this strategy is that a muscle can perform more positive work if it is actively stretched before being allowed to shorten. There's a lot of keys. The 2 keys are underlined: eccentric, concentric, and actively stretched. Okay, that was from the Neuromechanical Basis of Kinesiology. Now I'm going to read you just a quick little excerpt from another fantastic book. It's called Strength and Power in Sport, and it's by Comey, one of the original eccentric load, stretch, shorten, plyo guys out there. In fact, this book was given to me by a good friend of mine, Pete Dravich, so I don't know if you guys know Pete. And I'll just read you, and I just want to show you, this is a slightly different wording, but just so you understand what we're talking about. It says, in these phases, the muscles are acting eccentrically and concentric action follows. By definition of eccentric action, the muscles must be active during the stretching phase. The combination of eccentric and concentric actions forms a natural type of muscle function called a stretch-shorten cycle, or SSC. The purpose of SSC, or stretch-shorten cycle, is to make the final action, which is the concentric shortening of the muscle, more powerful than resulting from concentric action alone. One little other quick quote, because we're talking about a complex motion in terms of golf swing. They make a mention in the next section. Whole body exercise, in this case we're talking about an activity like golf, but whole body exercise involves many joints and many groups of muscles. In this complex but well coordinated act, each muscle makes its own contribution using usually in the form of stretch shorten action. So in the golf swing, it's very difficult to isolate any one muscle or even muscle group. We have groups of muscles acting about multiple joints, all contributing in a stretch shorten cycle manner. It's fairly complicated, obviously, but the outcome, or sort of the end product, is pretty simple, or at least reasonably understood when it comes to application. The first thing, or last thing I say for this slide, really quick, is the concept of muscle being actively stretched. The concept, if you think of it, is pretty simple, but it can be a little confusing. If we look at something simple, and I'll just draw a picture here. If we think of the shoulder to the elbow to the wrist, okay, we have our bicep and we have our tricep attached like this. If and muscles basically only shorten, they don't lengthen. They're either on or off. And so when you, say for example, want to move the elbow in an extension action, the tricep group is going to contract, shorten, to pull the arm this direction. The bicep has to relax in order for that to occur. So it relaxes. As it relaxes, it's obviously being lengthened, but it's not active. It's not being actively fired or innervated. The nervous system isn't trying to fire motor units and shorten the muscle. So it's passively being lengthened. In the stretch shorten cycle, the muscle has to be actively lengthened. So what does that mean? Well, that means that, let's take the same scenario. The tricep group muscles fires, pulls the arm this direction, at first the bicep is relaxed. It's not being fired and it's being lengthened in a passive way. But now let's say we want to quickly change direction from being extended into going back into flexion. And let's even add some weight. Let's say we have a weight in our hand, so we're doing like a bicep curl, and we want to bring that weight up. And let's say it's a heavy weight, so we have to exert a lot of force. As the weight moves this direction, first initiated by this group of muscles will start to be innervated, will start to be fired, and the nervous system will be firing these muscles, trying to shorten them to move the arm now in a flexion direction. The momentum of the action in the extension direction is going to pull the bicep longer, is going to lengthen the bicep muscle, even though it's being fired. Okay, and so the muscle is being fired like crazy, especially if you've got a heavy weight with some momentum. The muscle is being fired, a lot of motor units, a lot of activity, but because of the momentum in the opposite direction, that's what we call a counter movement. The motion in the opposite direction is lengthening the bicep as it's being fired, and that's active stretching. Well, just as I described it to you, you can imagine that if a muscle is being innervated, if the nervous system is trying to fire motor units and shorten cross bridges and do all the things that muscles do, you've got a ton of electrical and chemical action going on in that muscle that's not being used to shorten, because really the only thing the muscle wants to do is shorten. So there's a ton of energy, potential energy, that's being created through this action that's not being utilized because the muscle's not being shortened. That's the energy, the potential energy that is referred to a lot in golf as coiling, which gives you this idea that the muscle wraps up the body wraps up like a big spring, and then just mechanically stores that potential, and then bam, you let it go and it flies like a rubber band or something. It's not like that at all. The muscles are being innervated, actively stretched. There's this chemical, electrical energy that's being created. That energy can be used to make the contraction. Once this starts to actually shorten, it overcomes the momentum in the opposite direction. That contraction can be greatly enhanced by that buildup of potential energy. The problem is that it's fleeting. That energy is fleeting, and if it's not utilized right away, like within fractions of a second, if it's not utilized immediately, it just dissipates, and so you don't get the real benefit of the active stretch and that stretch shorten cycle. So let's take a look just really quickly, and then we're going to go to the article itself. Excuse me. Let's just look at the core, because this muscular loading happens all the way up from if we think of the lower body as their own entity, and there are applied force or external torque, they start the power process. Once we get up into the pelvis and we work through the core out to the extremities and then to the golf shaft or the golf club itself, and we're talking about a sequence of stretch shorten, the stretch shortening not only creating enhanced contraction, more force output, more power, more work done, but it's also a very crucial part of a kinetic link process whereby the body is essentially conserving momentum, transferring speed from segment to segment, exponentially increasing that speed so that by the time you get out to the club head, you have an incredible amount of speed generated in a very short period of time. So what happens here is that you get lower body mechanics, which we're not going to get into tonight, creating applied force, torque, and initial rotation on the downswing. In transition from backswing to downswing, you get the lower body working first. They're attached to the ground, the pelvis working first. It's attached to the ground. The ground and the reaction to force applied to the ground is what creates torque and allows us to move. Then we do get an acceleration of the lower body, while the counter movement, when you can think of the counter movement again as being our simple flexion extension of the bicep, the counter movement's the extension, and now all of a sudden the first segment, the hips, they start going into flexion. So they start this process. Now every ripple along the way, all the muscle groups all the way out, go through their own version of this. So you get a sequential effort, muscle group to muscle group, body segment to body segment, of stretch shortening, and each factor builds in the muscle's ability to create work output and power, but also helps in this process of transferring speed through the kinetic chain, segmentally summating speed. We're not going to get to that tonight as well, because that's again another webinar in and of itself. But the key here is that what happens is you get an acceleration of the first body segment from the force input. The upper torso is working in its counter movement still, and the action of this moving, if we're looking down the spine counterclockwise, while the upper torso still has lag or some clockwise movement, stretches the muscles. Okay, so you're in your backswing, you're creating some counter movement. You now work against that momentum, and you allow the muscles to be quickly stretched. And as they stretch, they go through the active loading, which is that stretch shorten cycle. And then when they contract, they're going to have, so when this muscle group is we have obliques and lats and a whole bunch of stuff going on, but when as a whole, these muscles fire and act, they're going to be enhanced in their contraction, which is going to create better power output, and they're going to grab the more proximal segment to accelerate the more distal segment, and you're going to get kinetic link sequencing. So not only is the concept of X factor or X factor stretch, or if you just want to call it stretch shorten, not only is it important for creating more work output and performance, power performance, but it's absolutely crucial in the sequential timing of creating distal end speed, which is your club head speed. Okay, so enough of the boring stuff. Let's get into sort of taking a look at the article and see how it was applied in the article itself, and we can see where there's some really great stuff, and then there's potentially some misleading things. But all in all, it's pretty good stuff. Now again, here's where the original X factor, ads popping up here. The original X factor was just about static rotation. So how far did the pelvis turn at its maximum, and how far did the shoulder turn? And unfortunately, people started getting kind of fixated on these turns and backswing and creating separation and coil. Unfortunately, the body doesn't work that way, and coiling itself is just is misleading. So you get people trying to get these big backswings, which is great if you're a very flexible athletic person, or a PGA or LPGA level golfer who has incredible flexibility and skill. But for your average person, creating these big swings and trying to coil up, it's just not attainable. So what would happen, or what happens in almost all these cases, is we start recruiting mobility from places that should be stable, like our spine and our pelvis and our lower body. So we start trying to make these big swings by forfeiting places that should be stable to gain a little extra turn and range of motion. And so number one, the backswing itself, that big coil, as we talked about, isn't active stretching, so it's not doing anything in terms of muscle output. And secondly, when you start coming out of posture and forfeiting lower body dynamics and things, then you don't even have the ability to get the process started. So you end up, arm swinging and doing some really kind of crazy things to compromise for that. So the nice thing that Jim did in this one, probably the best thing in the whole article, was to make that differential. To say that the biggest misconception about X factor is that it maxes out the top of the backswing, and that's not true. The truth is the gap between your shoulder turn and hip turn he says should increase during the early part of the downswing, and that's true. Absolutely true. It's the best part of this article for sure, because making that differential to the general public is huge, and hopefully you'll get people making the turns that their body will allow them, and certainly seeking out professionals that can allow them to gain flexibility and mobility, but before they gain mobility, they have to work within their limits, and working within the limits, they can still create a huge amount of power output, because power output is more a function of acceleration during the downswing and not about backswing turn. And it says, because the X factor measures the amount of coil between the shoulders and the hips, the X factor stretch is how much that coil increases from the top to the first move down. So again, really great. I like that part of it. It's fantastic, because now what they're saying is it's not about this static turn mechanism, but it's about how well you start this action of eccentric concentric sequence, and that has to do with starting a counter movement, which is your backswing, and then moving against the counter movement, which is the initial movement of the lower body, to start a ripple effect of stretch shorten through the core. So now, you know, you get people focused more on the change of direction and the forward acceleration as the impetus, to say, to start that rippling eccentric load or active load eccentric concentric pattern throughout the body, which is great. And now it says, here's how it works. When you coil into your right side during the backswing, energy is transferred and stored into that side. Now, I love this first paragraph. This is a great, it's going to help a lot of people. This first sentence of the second paragraph, not as personally thrilled about. When you first of all, the concept of coil is just, I know it's semantics, but you know, it just gets people thinking that they're a big spring and they're going to wind up and then let it rip, and that's just not what happens. So it's, you know, it kind of keeps drumming into people's minds that they're a big spring, and they're looking more for turn than they are, and you know, kind of backswing separation than they are dynamic change of direction. But probably the part that I you know, have issue with more, and again, these aren't issues where there's, you know, in the world, but just as semantics or, you know, misleading concept. Energy is transferred and stored into that side. Honestly, I'm not really too sure exactly what that means, but what's going on is not a coil where you're pushing energy somehow to this side, and then it's stored on the right side, and then it's moved to the left side. What this is, at the end of the day, is a counter movement, which is your backswing. Okay, you start the action away, or in an eccentric way, away from the intended direction. That's your eccentric load portion, and then you accelerate into the counter movement to create a ripple effect of eccentric concentric pattern, which is the stretch shorten. So you're not loading. Now, I know part of what I think Jim is referring to is weight shift, and there's the concept of moving your center of pressure between your feet. The center of pressure is certainly going to move to the rear side, and then it's the forward movement of that center of pressure towards the left side that's going to create the ability to translate forward momentum into torque. But that's all lower body mechanics, and it really has nothing to do with energy or coil. It's about creating torque. And then, you know, the energy, or the coil, if you want to call it that, which I prefer not to, is really the musculature being stretch shortened, or eccentric concentrically loaded, actively stretched and then contracted in a sequence. So I definitely, you know, think that can be a little misleading. Now, he sort of, and it sounds funny to use it, and again, I think it's a great article. Like I said before, I have utmost respect for Jim and Rob, and they really know what they're talking about. It's just when you get in these formats, these short formats, it's hard to really make sense of these things. So it says, you release it properly through the correct sequence of body motion at the transition, starting with substantial lateral movement of the hips towards the target. Okay. He sort of makes up for the first sentence by the second. It is... The energy is created through the correct sequence of body motion. It's not released or transferred from right to left, but it is the initial lower body movement, which is a combination. And again, where he says starting with a substantial lateral movement. Again, he knows what he's talking about. But the thing is that you get people reading the article that want to jut their hips forward, you know, jut their center of mass forward, like, you know, kind of shoot out from underneath them. And really what Jim's referring to, and he knows how it feels, and what the Rob's numbers show, this is a press. It's a forward press, and it has a lot to do with how you grip the ground, how you create shear force and torque. And it's a forward press where the center of pressure, so again, I didn't want to get into a whole lower body thing, but during the backswing, the center of pressure moves quickly to the rear side, and the center of mass kind of lingers, and you have this sort of, you're out of balance, you're going to fall forward. It's not real obvious in golf. It's more like in pitching and throwing and hitting in tennis and things like that. It's more obvious when you stride, but then your center of pressure gets pushed forward, your center of mass gets pushed up to meet it, it's that pushing forward, that pressing forward into the ground, moving the center of mass that creates forward momentum, and that forward momentum then is translated into torque at the feet. So that's the concept in the article comes off a little misleading just because you got to jam it into like 3 sentences. Now he says in the next sentence, that's right, the upper body and lower body should work independently. That's another great phrase or statement. The upper body and lower body do work kind of independently in a sort of dissociated type of pattern, but obviously very related. But the ability to move one counterclockwise, one clockwise, things like that, that's incredibly important. The hips and legs separate from the upper body and start forward. So again, it's not so much about a lateral movement and this up and down movement of the pelvis. What it's about is pressing your center of mass into the front side. Your center of mass only moves about 17 to 20 centimeters total from the backswing, the end of the backswing and transition to the forward swing. But that's hardly anything. We're talking 17 to 20 centimeters. So there's not this really exaggerated lateral shifting. What it is more a function of center of mass pressed forward into the front side and that momentum being translated into torque or rotational speed. Now it says the last sentence here, the upper body, lower body should work independently. Hips and legs separate from the upper body, start forward. That's when the X factor peaks. Okay, so again, a lot of good information in that paragraph, and then some misleading stuff, mostly verbiage. That's the misleading part. But again, it's counter movement, so everything's working this direction. And again, you have to pull your mind a little bit out of golf swing mechanics, which is a little more focused on ball striking, and we're talking more about how the bodies function, the physiology, the biomechanics. So backswing in terms of biomechanics is nothing more than a counter movement. We get things moving in an opposite direction, and then we work using the lower body to create torque to rotationally accelerate the pelvis around the spine, around perpendicular to action of the spine, and that's what creates the first stretch shorten through those core musculature, and then bam, all the way out through the extremity, upper back, extremities, all the way out to the forearms, and eventually what happens is the arms are accelerated just prior to the impact area. They get decelerated dramatically, and the shaft and the club snaps away like a towel or a bullwhip, snaps away and makes contact with the ball, and then everything continues on through the forward swing, and so you get this really dramatic, it's brief, we're talking milliseconds of time, but this really dramatic deceleration of the arm segment and this towel snap of the club out away. So I will kind of finish up here a little bit. To maximize your stretch, learn to start the downswing with your lower body. It says place your left hand on your left front pocket and simulate a backswing with your right arm. Shift your hips towards the target, feeling your front left pocket move forward before you start your right arm down. And that's the X factor stretch. And again, the primary reason an average size tour player can drive the ball so far, this again is a good comment, but it's not necessarily the primary reason that the tour drive the average size tour player drives the ball so far. Certainly it's a cog in the wheel, but the real reason is a complex sequential pattern that the pro times perfectly, including the stretch shorten sequences, so that they have at the end of the day not just linear club head speed. So you not only have linear club head speed where your miles per hour, which is almost every one of us can maintain a fair portion of that, but they have angular release speed, so they have angular momentum as well. Their total amount of momentum on this side of the ball and at collision is very high, and their ability to translate momentum at collision is near perfect. So that's the primary reason that an elite level LPGA, PGA, whatever golfer can drive the ball so far. Interestingly, just as a quick anecdotal side note, I think you'll find that force outputs are higher in your amateur players. They're out of sequence, but they can be higher. Generally speaking, clubhead speeds are up there pretty well in addition. So in terms of force output, your average amateur is putting out pretty much the same force output if you want to kind of quantify muscle activity and things like that. It's the sequence of that output that allows distal end acceleration. So it's not the fact that the muscles create power. I mean, because if you look, there's a lot of really powerful, strong, athletic people who can't create hardly any clubhead speed, or certainly can't hit the ball anywhere. So the ability to create power is not as important as to create muscular force in a sequential pattern. When you use a sequential pattern, you're able to summate speed effectively and create not only a massive amount of linear speed, which is nice, but a massive amount of angular speed, which combined allows you to create a ton of momentum, that momentum being utilized at the point of impact and collision and impulse to send the ball very, very far, as long as the club face is square and everything, all the mechanic stuff that we're not talking about tonight. Real quick, I thought both the drills were actually really good. The only thing that I would say on both the drills, well, I could just read through them real quick. I have enough time. Turn your hips, cross your arms on your chest, simulate your golf swing back and through. As you turn through, create as much separation as you can between your shoulder turn and hip turn. Rotate your hips to the left as you hold your shoulders and back. The only thing, I think that's a good drill, and we've looked at a bunch of what we call like progressive skills stuff, and we include exercises like this and that. But the only thing that I would warn or hesitate people, warn is a strong word, but what you don't want to do is you don't want to over exaggerate this lateral shifting, and especially leaving your upper body hanging. It's a forward press. So the action itself is less of this lateral kicking forward, kind of shifting forward where the lower body almost gets out from underneath the upper body. It's more of a forward press. Very difficult to describe on a webinar. It's a lot easier to show or have someone feel, but it's a forward press. And the key thing is that the forward press is important because, first of all, you want to turn into the left joint, the left hip joint. You want to have internal rotation into that hip, so you're not sort of like tipping and sliding. You're turning into the hip, and when you do that and you're working perpendicular to your spine, you get symmetric action of the body segments to the spine. You get good core loading. You get that stretch shorten, and you get good muscular tension. That active load, that active stretch concept is way more effective. When you get too much lateral movement and tipping, you tend to not work perpendicular to the spine. You tend to bring yourself out of that perpendicular plane, and you don't get real effective loading of the core. So what ends up happening is you get more, rather than sort of diagonal load, multi-planar loads, let's say, through the core, you end up starting getting planar loads, like, just along this sort of frontal plane, where you're kind of bending left to right, where you're getting more like frontal or choroidal plane, singular kind of tipping action, rather than multi-plane diagonal pattern loading, like you might have, say, like a chop or a lift if you're a physical therapist, or actions like that. So this is obviously, I'm going to kind of wind down. Again, this is just a starting point. I'm sure for some of you I've created more questions than I've answered. But the key is that if you can start thinking of it like this, and you have resources to go explore, I would recommend the neuromechanical basis of kinesiology. You can buy that right online at Human Kinetics. The Strength and Power in Sport by Comey. Again, you can. I'm assuming you can probably buy that at Human Kinetics these days too. These are just textbooks that they're somewhat technical, but in a lot of ways they're written so that anybody without a physiology or even a biomechanics background can understand, and they're chock full of references to research that's been done in these areas. And again, you're not going to become biomechanists and scientists, but this information is starting to come out into the forefront now, and articles like Jim's is starting to bring these principles into the mainstream for the first time since I've been doing this since 91. These principles are becoming mainstream. It used to be just us stuck back in a lab at some place like American Sports Medicine Institute, where only the smallest population of doctors and high-end athletes had access to this stuff. Now you can have access to this kind of information right down the street at your local gym or performance center, certainly at your golf teaching centers these days. So as these concepts start coming out, I think it's important that people understand what the sources are and what the facts are, so to speak, behind these things. And we can answer questions, but maybe more importantly, we can get people on track to ask the right questions, because they'll understand better what the principles are. So I think like an article like this is fantastic. It brings it out into the forefront. I mean, how many people read this article? I mean, it's fantastic. There's so many good things in the article, and I just wanted to make sure, at least the population that we have tonight, that you start to understand what the real concepts are, and some of the misleading language we can work through and make sure that people aren't being misled, not necessarily by the science that went into this, because Rob's stuff is fantastic, and Jim's been doing this for a really long time, knows his biomechanics. It's mostly, when it gets into this format, the short kind of, concise, let's sell issues format, some of the language, some of the concepts get muted, and next thing you know, there's some misconceptions, and then misconceptions grow into myths, and the whole thing becomes mystified, and that obviously isn't going to get us anywhere. So in this day and age, with the advent of new technologies and new concepts allowing us to explore what's been the same basic golf swing forever, I think it's great. So hopefully you enjoyed the webinar. I'm going to pretty much wind down. Hopefully you got a chance to write all your questions up, and I'll answer them in a kind of a multimedia video Q&A that I can post later on our website. And hopefully you answer the survey as you leave, and any thoughts you have about tonight, and like I said, more importantly, maybe thoughts about the future, topics and areas you'd like to discuss. And they don't have to be in golf, quite frankly. We're going to be doing these in cycling and running and tennis and baseball and who knows, kayaking, hockey. So any thoughts you have, please jot down. Take 2 minutes to fill it out. It'd be great. Lastly, I'll just say, we'll keep sending out emails, but we can only reach a small portion of people. So if you know of people who might be interested in this, just pass on the information if you get it. These things are unlimited. We can have any number of people come, and the more the merrier, quite frankly. And we'll send out the emails, but next week our website will go live with a schedule of webinars, hopefully out at least a couple months with topics. They may change a little bit, but you'll get a pretty good idea. You can register in advance if you like, and you'll be able to kind of see what's going on in advance. And so if you see something down the road that you really want to, something on cycling or running or something that you really want to attend, you might be able to adjust your schedule a little bit if you know in advance. So I greatly appreciate everyone showing up, participating. I look forward to everyone's questions. I'm sure there are going to be a lot of good ones, and hopefully we'll see a bunch of you next week. We'll probably do another one next Thursday as it stands, and we haven't totally decided on a topic yet, but we'll have all those topics kind of ironed out at least for a couple months by next week, and so hopefully we'll see you next week. And again, I appreciate everyone coming. Thanks.